Hello everyone, my name is Kate, and today I'm here with Dr. Tom Cowan. Tom is a medical doctor from the United States. He is the author of many books such as Contagion Myth, Breaking the Spell, the Scientific Evidence for Ending the COVID Delusion, and the other great books such as Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, where Tom explains why our heart is actually not a pump. I have been following Tom's work for 2 years now, and he contributed tremendously to help people to start seeing clearly what is happening in the field of virology and what the problems are with methods that scientists use to back up their conclusions. Tom, could you please start with telling your story, how it happened that you as a medical doctor came to realize that there are big problems with the modern allopathic medicine?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And I appreciate all you're doing to help, especially young people. I think that's really your area, niche in this. So it's really great what you're doing.
Thank you.
All I can say is I grew up thinking that I should be a doctor, but because a lot of my parents' friends were doctors and my father and grandfather were dentists, and I didn't really like it. I just thought there was something wrong. So I decided to try to do something else. But then I learned about that there was a different way to do medicine. And so that actually allowed me to go to medical school, because I couldn't go thinking I was going to be a sort of normal doctor. And I didn't really know much about it. I just knew there had to be something different. So, and that was 45 years ago or so. So I was always interested in finding out what was real and what wasn't real in biology and medicine and, everything, economics. And so I just kept looking my whole career, my whole life, to find out not only what is real, but how do you know when something is real? And that's sort of the interesting and maybe tricky part, because once you know how to know something, then it's much easier to figure out what's real and what isn't real. And I could give you an example of that, but and maybe I will. So what I discovered is that there's basically two ways of knowing what's real. One is you have a direct experience, right? Like, how do you know you have a hand? And I can tell by, I can see it and it does stuff. Like, I can pick up this pencil and I have a very direct experience of this. And that's a very good, reliable way of knowing about the world. The other way is there are things that you can't possibly know just through normal direct experience, right? And so then you have to do something we call science. The problem is when you do that, you have to make sure that whatever you're doing doesn't change what you're trying to find out. Like if I take this pencil and say, is this pencil real? And I burn it down into ashes and send it through an X-ray machine, I have to know that the burning it and the X-ray machine don't change what I'm looking at. And sometimes you can know that and sometimes you can't. And that's the problem in science and medicine, is they essentially forgot about that the methods determine what you find and even whether it's really there. So that's sort of how I've gone about doing this for 35, 40 years.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom. My next question for you is, how did you come to understand that the germ theory is false and that viruses do not exist and that contagion is a myth?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting question, because if you because if you go back to these two ways of knowing that I just said, most people would say, well, there is a phenomena of transmission of illness. In other words, I got sick and then my wife got sick and my children got sick, or the other way around, and then a whole bunch of people got sick. And so it looks like something is being spread from one person to another. So just from an experiential point of view, that seems real. The problem is, so I could give you an example of, so the principle of that theory is, if you see a bunch of people in the same place or animals getting sick in the same way, that means something is spread between them. And since you don't see anything, it must be something smaller than you can see, like a bacteria or even a virus. But if you think about that as a principle, like what about this example? Let's say you have a basement, you go to a new house, you have a basement, it's full of rats, and you don't know what to do, but a friend of yours, unbeknownst to you, comes and puts a bunch of rat poison down in your basement. Next day, you see 2 dead rats. Next day, you see 3 dead rats, and they all bleed to death. You can see it. Next day, 10 dead rats. Next day, 100, etc. Based on our original premise that if you see animals or people having the same symptoms one after another, that proves it's contagion. It must be that the rats have a virus or a bacteria. But clearly they don't. They've been poisoned by rat poison. And the fact of the matter is, this mistake has been made many times throughout history, with everything from smallpox to pellagra and beriberi and scurvy. You know, one sailor after another got sick and their teeth fell out. They went into heart failure and died, and everybody thought it was some contagion, and they quarantined them, and it didn't get better. And then somebody ate a lemon or a lime, and the whole thing went away because turns out they had scurvy. So that convinced me that you can't tell based on just seeing what happens, that there may be a common toxin or a common psychological or emotional or something. Or it may be that human beings communicate or animals communicate in unseen, unknown ways. And so if you want to find out whether it's a bacteria or a virus, you have to do a logical thing, which is take something from the person and isolate just the bacteria or the virus. Because the problem is, some people say, well, if you get bitten by a rabid dog, right, and then you get rabies, that proves it's a virus. And so I asked them, are you telling me the only thing in the saliva of a rabid dog? And just assuming for a minute that that's actually true, which I actually have my doubts, but let's say it is true. Are you saying the only thing in the saliva of a rabid dog is a virus? I mean, that's ridiculous. There's enzymes and proteins and salivary juices, whatever they are, and the fear and everything else. So you can't say it's a virus unless you just take the virus out and then put that on the next person or animal in the same way, like not injected in their heart or something, but same way, and find out if they get rabies. So I spent years looking for this, and they never found a virus in any sick person, that's for sure. Not in any fluid did they find any particle you could call a virus. And because of that, they haven't isolated or removed the virus and shown that it causes disease. Now, with bacteria, you can find bacteria in sick people. Now, it turns out that some people have the bacteria and aren't sick, and some people who have the same sickness don't have the bacteria, which makes it suspicious that it's not the bacteria. But it is true, like with people with strep throat, some of them, maybe all of them, have this bacteria. But unfortunately, or fortunately, that doesn't prove the bacteria are causing the illness, because just because something is there doesn't prove it's the cause. Like there's typically firemen at the scene of fires, but one can't say that proves the firemen caused the fires. And with the bacteria, you'd have to do the same thing, take the bacteria, isolate them so you don't have pus and all kind of salivary enzymes or whatever, and expose in a normal way to a person the bacteria alone and see if they get sick in the same way. And as far as I know, there's no study showing that. So it wasn't like some mystical belief that I had. I just looked at the evidence and I didn't care whether it was true or not. I mean, what difference does it make to me? If there's bacteria, then it's their bacteria. If there aren't causing disease, then they're not. And it turned out there weren't, and that the bacteria are there to eat dead and dying tissue, just like they do in nature. And the whole concept of a virus is a misconception. They're just dead and dying particles from decaying diseased tissue.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was extremely clear. Let's talk a little bit more about bacteria, and one example, such as, for example, strep throat. The mainstream medicine always tells us that it's a bacterial infection and that antibiotics are the only cure for strep throat. And what is happening in reality in this example with strep throat? What would you say?
So here's an example. And I treated people with strep throat without antibiotics for 30 years. So first of all, I know that, in fact, interestingly, if you look at the medical literature, they say that there is no difference in the amount of time it takes to recover from strep throat with or without antibiotics. That's actually what we're taught. They say the reason for giving antibiotics is to stop you from getting rheumatic fever, but it has nothing to do with the resolution of the illness. So an example was a guy who he was normal, and then he had braces put in and a bunch of metal in his mouth. And then after that, he started getting sore throats. And they cultured it, and there was bacteria there called strep. And then they would give him penicillin and it would go away. And then he would get it over and over again until they took the braces out, and then the whole thing went away. So that's an example. So what happens? So he put a bunch of metals in his mouth, which probably, caused a certain toxic reaction in his throat, and the tissue started dying. And like any time in nature, like if a tree dies, you get bacteria and fungus eat the tree. If a dog dies, you get, flies and bacteria eating the dog. Nobody thinks the flies killed the dog or the fungus killed the tree. And when you have the bacteria living on the dead tissue, it causes certain symptoms that we call pain and inflammation and fever. And so there's a correlation between the symptoms and the presence of the bacteria. So if you kill the bacteria, the symptoms will go away, and now you just have dead and dying, decaying tissue. And so it'll happen again, just like with this person. And then it'll happen again and again and again, until then it gets deeper into your body, and now you have all kinds of trouble from the toxicity of the antibiotics. Plus you have, decaying matter that's staying in your body. And so that's exactly what you see. You see something happened, either an emotional or poisoning or metals or something. It depends on the situation, what the original insult. And then you get decaying tissue, the bacteria live on it, that creates symptoms, which is the healing phase. And unfortunately, the doctors don't know that, so they give you penicillin or some other antibiotics to stop the healing, in which case you become chronically sick. including rheumatic fever, and that just keeps going on. So, that's the whole story of strep throat. So the solution is don't poison yourself in the first place, and then you don't get decaying tonsils, and then you don't make the bacteria are always there. It's not they're just doing what they're supposed to do. They're not a cause of the illness.
Thank you so much. Let's also talk about the fever in general, because it's also a very big question from people, especially from parents, when they are worried about little kids that have high fever. And the mainstream medicine explains us that fever happens because the body is producing the heat to kill the pathogenic bacteria or viruses. And if it's not the case, which purpose our body, for which purpose our body is rising the temperature?
So for that, you have to understand another foundational principle, which is, it turns out, and I can't really show this right now, but when you get right down to what do we know that our tissues are made out of? We have, you can look at cells, and they say they're made of Golgi apparatus and ribosomes and, endoplasmic reticulum and all this stuff. And most of that, if not all of it, are artifacts of how we produce images, like electron microscope images. So really, a living system is in organized water, like Jell-O. It's a gel. It's some people call it structured water or easy water, or there's various names, coherent water. But imagine Jell-O, right? So it's a gel. And every living system is made of these gels. That's what we're made of. And so I tell people, it's like you have a poison grape dissolved in your gel, right? So the metal or it could be an emotional, whatever it is, some toxin dissolved in your gel. So how would you clean the gel? Well, you don't have a little scooper to get the grape out. So the body developed this system where it melts the gel, and it does that with fever. And then it allows the gel to purify itself, which we call mucus or snot. And then you cough that up with the poison grape, and then you reconstitute a more perfect gel. So that's really what you see. And so there's no need for bacteria or viruses, except the bacteria just help with the remodeling of the gel. They essentially help digest the gel a little bit. But it's really the fever that melts the gel, and then you can flush it out and then reconstitute it again. And that's exactly the sequence of events we see with all illness. Now, again, normal medicine, because they misunderstand basically everything, they say that's trying to kill the bacteria or viruses, which is nonsense. And so they go ahead and stop the fever, and then you can't dissolve away the poisons. And then we know it takes longer to get over the illness, or you never get over it. And then you go on from having, a cold to having asthma and eczema and all kinds of other problems. So the fever is the dissolver of the gels so that we can reform new and more perfect gels.
Thank you so much. So of course it would be extremely detrimental to reduce the fever with medications, because so many people are afraid that something will happen with their brain or they will die.
There is no evidence that the height of the temperature or any fever causes any damage. Now, that's not to say that the process of being sick causes damage, right? People can die from acute illness, but it's not the fever. There is no evidence of that. That is actual, I would say, as close to a scientific fact as we can get. And one of the ways we know that is because in various types of like cancer medicine, they use hyperthermia treatment, where they heat people up to 106 degrees Fahrenheit and nothing happens. It doesn't feel good, but there's no toxicity from the fever. So decreasing the fever is, a fool's quest. All it does is it prevents your body from going through the healing process. And without the healing process, you're forced to repeat it and to actually have a worse sickness.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. My next question for you was about what you already mentioned about the modern cell theory that I really find so incredible when I discovered it myself. And I would like to talk a little bit more profoundly about this so people understand what do you mean when you said that ribosomes and other cell components are actually artifacts and they don't exist. So it's the work of Harold Hillman and Gilbert Link, two biologists. Can we talk a little bit about this now? Why modern cell theory is actually wrong?
Right. So the way I approach this, I explained this a little bit, but maybe I'll do it again. When I tried to figure out what we're made of, the way I did it was I asked myself, so what is a human being made of? And I asked a lot of people and they gave me all kinds of answers. But the answer that I came up with is we have, a head and we have ears and eyes and mouth and fingers and toes and chest and all that stuff. So again, how do I know that? There's two ways of knowing something. You can either observe it or you can do a controlled scientific experiment. But that's pretty easy. I can just see you have a head and eyes, and I do too. And everybody I know does. There may be an exception, but we can pretty much discount that. And every scientific traditional medicine or agreed with that. Human beings have all those things. So then I looked deeper, and then I said, underneath that, there's organs like lungs and heart, liver, spleen, nerves, and I can't exactly see those by looking, but you can use instruments like ultrasounds and x-rays, and you can feel it. And you can also even, cut somebody open, or they get shot. And I was an ER doctor for a while. So I've seen spleens and hearts and lungs and all that stuff. And again, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, they all believe there's organs in our bodies. So far, so good. And then I looked at one tissue like a liver. And I said, what is the liver made of? And the obvious answer was liver cells. Now, when I said to myself, or asked people, have you ever seen a liver cell in a living person? The answer is no. You can't, there's no microscope where you can stick a tube in somebody and see a liver cell. You can't see them in an ultrasound, an MRI, X-ray, CT scan, nothing. All you can do is take the piece of liver out of liver and then stain it and dye it and cut it up into little pieces and put it under a microscope, and then you can see these compartments called cells. Now, the question that Hillman in particular asked was, how do you know that removing something from a living system didn't change what you're looking at, and particularly make it form into compartments here? I mean, he believed in cells. And how do you know that staining something doesn't create divisions? I'm not saying it does, but in order to say that it doesn't, you have to know that for sure. The problem is it's very difficult to know that in this case. But what we do know is that out of 188 tissues, lungs and eye, lens of your eye and liver and spleen, 44 of them have no internal divisions. They're what are called syncytium, which is basically just organized water. The other 144, we think we're seeing cells. So, but I would just caution that, again, we don't have a appropriate control, because unless you can see a cell in a living system, you don't actually know it was there. And all these things that we do, especially staining and dyeing and drying, they change dramatically what we're looking at. But anyway, let's assume for a minute there's cells. Now, you can then look at a cell and say, well, what do you see in a cell? And you see ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, cell membranes, nuclei, mitochondria, all the rest. The only things you can see in a light microscope are a thin cell membrane, organized water, mitochondria, and a nucleus. That's it. Nothing else you can see. Now, how do you know there are ribosomes? And interestingly, ribosomes are very important to the whole science and biology and medicine, because we're told that's where RNA is made into proteins. So here's what you have to do. You have to see it in an electron microscope, which means removing it, putting it into a blender, drying it, soaking it in alcohol and glutaraldehyde, staining it with heavy metals, or freezing it to 100 degrees below 0 centigrade. Then you shoot an electron beam at it, and it's totally dehydrated, basically a precipitate, right? A solid, whatever you get after all those processes. And then, interestingly, every known picture of a ribosome is a perfect sphere. Perfect sphere. Now let's think about that. What are the chances if you took an orange, right, sphere? So if it's a perfect sphere on a microscope slide, or a perfect circle, it was a sphere in real life, right? Has to be. So let's say you took an orange and put it in a blender and then dehydrated it and froze it to 160 degrees. What are the chances that every piece of that would be a perfect circle? 0, right? It's 0.
Yes.
Yet we're told that this thing is a perfect sphere, and we did all those things in order to see it. And Hillman went through the whole story of how people ended up thinking they were real, and there's no evidence that it's real. This is an artifact, meaning it's an artificial creation of the process. And he actually proved that these are gas bubbles that are formed with dead and dying tissue. And gas bubbles are spherical, even after all that. And all you're seeing are the stains. And so basically you're looking at something that there is no possibility that it was there in the actual living tissue. And then you have cell membranes that are supposedly double layers. And if 2 cell membranes came together, there would be 4 layers. But you never see 4 layers. You only see 2 layers. And you get 2 layers if you just put a protein and then you stain it. You get 2 layers on either side of the protein. And so the whole cell membrane lipid bilayer thing is also an artifact. And then he went on, a synapse in a nerve. You never see that in a light microscope. You just see a continuous nerve. Now, if you realize that the way you saw the synapse, which again is a huge part of modern biology, right? All of the nerve transmission, the drugs, serotonin, are all these neurotransmitters that traverse the synapse. But there is no synapse except if you dehydrate and stain the tissue, which case the nerve pulls apart, and then you have a gap, and you have stain on either side, and those are the pre and post synaptic vesicles. And so it's also completely an artifact. There is no synapse in any nerve in real life. And I know people hearing that will say, are you kidding? But if you just follow sound reasoning and let me see the control of how you saw this without doing those things, that doesn't exist. And by the way, I'm very early in my investigation, but the whole concept of DNA is looking pretty shaky to me, because it's all based on a picture back in, I think, 1952 by a woman named Rosalind Franklin. And I don't want to get into this too much, but the picture is of a dehydrated nucleus that was exposed to an X-ray for 62 continuous hours. Now, imagine if you expose yourself to an X-ray for 62 continuous hours, and then you see what's called a diffraction pattern, which means like dots on a screen. And she said, well, there's the DNA, it's in a double helix because the diffraction pattern. And I mean, this is nuts. So bottom line is, ever since the 1850s, when the whole cell theory and the whole modern way of investigation, which fundamentally changes what we see, that's the problem. And the assumption that what we do doesn't change what we see, which is, I mean, totally ridiculous.
Yes, thank you so much, Tom. This is extremely interesting. Yeah, I mentioned this because in my opinion, it is also very important to understand when we talk about virology and viruses, because they always tell us, for example, that SARS-CoV-2 virus comes into our cells through these receptors that are on the membrane, and these receptors, ACE2, it's called, it does not actually exist. And what is interesting, this, as far as I understood, this is just an enzyme, and this enzyme was not even expressed in the lung. So it wasn't found. It was found in big quantities in male testicles, and we don't see any males in the hospitals or something like this. So like, this is a very important puzzle to understand about the cell theory and what's wrong with it, also when you investigate the virus question.
Right. There are no cell membrane bound receptors.
Yeah.
Hillman was very clear on that. And again, the evidence is, so number one, you don't see them ever in a light microscope picture. Now, the argument is, well, they're too small. Okay, so you can't see them because they're too small. So then you look at electron microscope pictures and you never see anything sticking out of the membrane. You sometimes see it's fuzzy, but that's not a receptor. And so there's no actual physical evidence that this receptor is in the membrane. So what they're talking about is some protein or some enzyme that may or may not be found in certain tissue. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't proteins or enzymes dissolved in your cytoplasm, and nor am I saying that certain enzymes might not bind to certain other things outside of the cell or tissue. But anything like a protein-bound cell membrane receptor, I mean, that's just make-believe. So you're right, the whole theory starts falling apart, and you realize that, you know, there are no ACE2 receptors. There's no spike protein from any kind of organism called a virus. This whole sort of docking phenomena is pure make-believe. And the whole theory, you know, when you look at the theory of viruses have this spike, which, by the way, you don't even really see, except you see dots on electron microscope pictures, but those are exactly the same kind of dots you see with broken down kidney cells or lung cells, so they don't mean anything. And some of the people can't even find the spikes. They have to add trypsin, which digests away the outside, and then by miraculous, they see the spike. So they say the spike protein connects to the receptor, it injects its business inside the cell. It's like a rapeseed. And then it takes over the machinery of the cell, has its way with the cell, reproduces itself, and emerges victorious from the cell to go get its next victim. I mean, this is like fairy tale, although that's negative on fairy tale. Fairy tales are a lot more profound than that story there. But the reality is the only thing they actually see is there's no particle in the beginning, and then there's a lot of particles at the end. That's all they actually measure. And all the stuff in between is just conjecture, the docking and the reproduction, et cetera. They say, well, there was nothing there in the beginning, and then there's a lot there at the end. It must have reproduced, which is, my analogy is, so you go to a house and there's no paper outside the house, and then you blow up the house and then there's a lot of paper, and you conclude that the paper must have injected itself into the house, reproduced itself, made a lot of paper, blew up the house, and that's why it's all over your yard. And obviously that's nonsense, as is the whole theory of virology.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. So my last question for you is this one. What, in your opinion, is the major obstacle that prevents people to see and learn the truth about these false theories in medicine? And what can be done about it? So one day we as humanity can really forget about viruses and the fear of contagion.
Yeah, it's an individual process, this. So there's a couple, I mean, it's a very difficult question, because that's why I keep referring to this as a spell or even a cult. And, I have a certain experience with cults, not personally, but in my family. And what you realize when you're dealing with somebody in a cult is that the emotional support and the meaning in their life that comes from being part of this group is more important than anything else. And often, when you're in a cult, they kick out everybody else. So they kick out all your family and friends. Even sometimes you can't make a living otherwise. So your whole life is based on being part of this group. Now, if somebody comes along and says, I don't think this cult thing is right, I don't think it makes any sense. At that point, the person realizes they have a decision. They can either say, okay, let me hear what you're saying and see if I agree. And that means I have to change my whole life, right? I'm no longer part of my group. I don't have any friends. I don't have any family. I don't have any money. I don't have any emotional support. I'm like a little child who's been kicked out in the wilderness. Or you can say, I'm not listening to that, or I'm not going to believe it. And unfortunately, that's really what's happening now. There's too high a stakes for people to even listen. And it's interesting when you talk to somebody like that, they immediately start thinking of reasons why it can't be true. Well, the government wouldn't do anything to hurt us. Or how could they keep all this secret for so many years? Or how come all these virologists don't understand it? And how come there's so much studies showing that this isn't true? Or I saw Aunt Bessie get sick and then Uncle Harry got sick, and so it must be a virus. None of those have anything to do with whether there's a virus or not. Whether somebody is doing gain of function research or messing around with snake venoms or whatever, has no relevance to whether there's actually a virus. And so that's the kind of thing that people say as a sort of defense mechanism. I don't want to believe this, so I make up some sort of nonsense. I mean, I've talked to some of the leaders in the freedom and health movements, and I'll say, what's your evidence that there's a virus causing sickness? And they'll say things like, well, how do you explain gain of function research? And I say, well, that's a political answer to a science question, right? The proof that there's a virus is, isolated from the tissues, characterize it, all this stuff. The fact that there's a bunch of labs doing research on God knows what, I think, doesn't have anything to do with whether there's a virus or not. But, that's what he thinks. Now, how to get out of that? I mean, nobody knows really. And it's also very difficult. It's, everybody who deals with people in, bona fide cults knows how difficult it is. But one thing you can do, and I started doing, is if people ask me this, I turn it around and say, well, tell me how you know there's a virus and that it causes disease. I mean, I've had people, interview me from science journals and magazines and BuzzFeed and all these things. The science editor of whatever, they say, they want to say Tom's an idiot. And so I say, okay, I'll talk to you, but first tell me how you know there's a virus. They have no clue. They have no clue. They're the people who are telling the people the information about this virus. So they don't know. And so if you don't know, anybody can fool you, right? They can tell you whatever and you don't know, so you just believe it. And what I ended up getting good at is waiting. Okay, tell me how you know there's a virus. And then I just sit there and they don't say anything. Now, usually after 10 seconds or so, people expect you to say something like, well, never mind, or here's how it is. But I don't say anything. And I wait for them to make the next move. And they'll say something, like, well, Aunt Bessie got sick, so that proves. And I'll say why that's not true. And then I'll wait. And you get good at waiting, and then you can feel the discomfort arising in people. So now they're confronted with their own realization that they have a core belief, it's running their life, and yet they don't actually know where it's coming from. And I just let them sit with that until 10 minutes. And then I don't know what happens then, like they have to leave or something. And it's sometimes at that point you can have a conversation. And I encourage them to try to understand where their response is coming from. Like, do you really think that, because Aunt Bessie got sick, that's what a virologist does? He goes around asking if anybody's aunt got sick, and if they are, that proves it's a virus. Like, that's ridiculous. So I think it helps to have people say ridiculous things because they hear themselves, which is different than you telling them something. They don't listen to that. And at that point, we're going to see what happens. And my hope is that enough people realize that this has got us nowhere, and that we've failed. It's just like scurvy. Once you realize it's vitamin C, you can eat an orange and you can be better. Once you realize that it's the way we live and the way we think and the way we see the world, that's what's causing our troubles, then it's easy to change. But if you don't see it, you can't change it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Well, I see a lot of progress actually, because if you compare what is happening now to the times, for example, when the AIDS and HIV story started, we have so much more people who are talking the truth, and we have so much more people listening to it, and we actually are talking about the root. So we are talking not about if this virus is detrimental or not, we are talking about the existence. So we did a lot of progress, I think. So I really see a lot, I see the light in the end of tunnel soon, hopefully during my life. But I really want to thank you so much for your dedication and your work, because you managed to wake up so many people to this truth around the world. And I'm so grateful for your work. And you also taught me so many things that I would never know without you. So I'm extremely grateful. And I wish you all the best, and I wish you all the best for your work and for everything you do, and to write many more books, because you do it so brilliantly. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And yeah, I tell people, you know, we're just getting started. The virus thing is an easy one. There's a lot more to go of finding out what's real in this world and what isn't, because the story we're told is just does not make sense.
Yes.
So there's a long way to go here. And I encourage people to, rather than to think it's scary and oh my God, it's fun. I mean, you get to learn new things. I mean, what's more interesting and fun than that?
Yes, nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Kate.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.